So this is episode number 6 of our walkthrough what every Christian ought to know about the Bible but usually doesn't. We'll have one more installment at some point, probably not too far in the future. Today we're looking at the conflicts in the philosophical, theological, and ethical content of the Gospels. The canonical Gospels, in particular, and other books comprising the New Testament in general, vary considerably in their philosophical, theological, and ethical content. The most striking variation concerns how Jesus' teachings are depicted regarding the poor and the nature of our ethical duties to our fellow humans. This is most notably observed by contrasting the moral teachings of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, with certain passages in the Gospel of John, and with that Gospel generally. All three synoptic Gospels depict an event in Jesus' teaching ministry, where a man approaches Jesus and asks what he must do to inherit eternal life. In response, Jesus lists the most important commandments to follow. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, and Matthew adds, honor your parents. After the man assures Jesus that he has followed these rules since his youth, Jesus adds a final and to many surprising injunction. Go, sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. The man turns away dejected and leaves because he is respectively described as having many possessions or being very rich, depending on the gospel you're reading. Jesus then makes his famed observation about the extreme difficulty rich people will have in attaining salvation. Matthew, uniquely, describes Jesus giving an account of a future apocalyptic judgment of humanity at the end of the present corrupt age by an all-powerful righteous judge. It is one of the most famous passages in the whole Bible and was read by Veronica as today's reflection. It is central to many contemporary articulations of Christian morality and ethics. The righteous judge in this story is called the Son of Man, a phrase first appearing in the Hebrew Bible book of Daniel, a book that we learned in the third installment of this series was the last of the books written that was eventually included in the Hebrew canon of Scripture, which would eventually be called the Old Testament by the new religion of Christianity. Daniel was also the first of a series of non-canonical apocalypses written by ancient Jewish writers. In this famed passage, Jesus tells his listeners, 1, that the divine is embodied and literally resides in the oppressed and the downtrodden. 2, that service to the oppressed is direct service to God. And 3, that this service is the primary and indeed only measure of individual righteousness and worthiness for salvation. In this story, the righteous judge of human history is utterly indifferent to whether or not someone believed in any God. It is a person's deeds in the aid of the disadvantaged and oppressed that are the measure of one's moral standing. One other parable, this one only from Luke, relates to this theme, and is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here, responding to a question about who is my neighbor, Jesus tells the parable of the compassionate Samaritan who comes to the aid of a mugged and wounded traveler after a Levite and a priest pass him by and do nothing. The Samaritan went to the victim and, in the language of Luke, bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them, then put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you need." Jesus then asked his interlocutor, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who had fell into the hands of robbers?" Jesus' questioner acknowledged that it was the one who showed him mercy. The story concludes with Jesus saying, "Go and do likewise." The moral outlook illustrated by these synoptic materials stands in stark contrast to the outlook of John's Gospel, a book written 10 to 20 years later. There, Jesus shows no interest in the poor or oppressed, and indeed at one point states that the needs of the poor may be properly ignored so his feet can be anointed with an expensive oil. Only Judas, Jesus' eventual betrayer, objects to this and expresses concern for the poor. The omniscient narrator of John, however, assures the reader that Judas' concern is insincere. This is the only location in this gospel where concern for the poor is even mentioned, and ultimately dismissed. Jesus is also depicted as having rich followers and patrons, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. In John, instead of service and concern for others, the primary focus is on how eternal life comes through a person's belief in Jesus. John 3:16 is the most important example of this. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son to be martyred, so that everyone who believes in Jesus may not perish, but have everlasting life." Jesus himself is depicted as emphasizing belief as the core duty, and eating his flesh and drinking his blood as some sort of essential ritual for the attainment of salvation. In John, unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus explicitly declares himself to be the Son of God, and the apocalyptic figure, the Son of Man, who has the authority to execute judgment upon all of humanity and determine each human's eternal fate. Here, unlike in Matthew, your belief is all that matters, not your service to the oppressed. Famed New Testament scholar Elaine Pagels also notes that John is by far the most anti-Semitic of the Gospels, because it depicts the Jews, in the language of John, as having had sole responsibility for Jesus' execution against the will of Pilate, who is depicted as repeatedly trying to free Jesus, but finally gives in to the demands of the Jews. Many scholars note that this portrayal of Pilate is patently unbelievable in light of what is otherwise known of Pilate. Regardless, John's gospel laid the foundation for 2,000 years of violent anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish bigotry, a plague that has lived on into the present and is now resurging in strength. The next subject matter is, did Jesus preach an imminent apocalyptic end of the world? The Apostle Paul predicted the imminent end of the world in 1 Thessalonians, the earliest of the New Testament books. It is further undeniable that Jesus is depicted in places as predicting an imminent end of the world in the first of the Gospels written. In Mark 13:30, Jesus seemingly is predicting that his hearers would not pass away until all these things have taken place, leading the famed Christian apologist C.S. Lewis to call that verse the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, because it showed Jesus making a now demonstrably false prediction. And this mistake is repeated in Matthew 24:34 and Luke 21:32. As regular attendees here at Greater Purpose know, a group of New Testament scholars known as the Jesus Seminar began in the 1980s, a quest for the authentic sayings of Jesus, and published their findings in 1993. They concluded that the Jesus of history was a non-apocalyptic teacher of a countercultural wisdom, a rural Galilean sage that in some ways mirrored the cynics of his time. Indeed, Dominic Crossan, one of the prominent scholars associated with the Jesus Seminar, explicitly argued that Jesus was a peasant Jewish cynic. The other prominent historian associated with the Jesus Seminar was the late Marcus Borg. He too rejected the apocalyptic understanding of Jesus and instead believed the data in the canonical Gospels and additional non-canonical materials discovered in the 1940s and analyzed by scholars beginning in the 1970s disclose a historical Jesus who is a combination of peasant Jewish mystic, wisdom teacher, social prophet, and movement initiator. Borg's Jesus is slightly different but congruent with Crossan's itinerant Jewish cynic. The leading contemporary scholarly proponent that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who was wrong about the imminent end of the world is Mark Ehrman, an argument first championed by Albert Schweitzer in his 1906 book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. The thumbnail of Ehrman's argument is that John the Baptist was an apocalyptic prophet before Jesus, that all available evidence about the initiators of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death shows that they had intense apocalyptic expectations. The Apostle Paul was unquestionably apocalyptic. In Ehrman's view, therefore, it only stands to reason that Jesus himself must also have been apocalyptic. Many contemporary New Testament scholars agree, including Dale B. Martin, the New Testament scholar some of us have been studying on our intermittent Wednesday night Bible studies. The Jesus Seminar affiliated scholars and those who follow them make the main counter-argument. When Jesus' parables and aphorisms are studied by themselves, they display a consistent absence of apocalyptic content. If Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, why would this be? It is quite plausible that an apocalyptic reimagining of Jesus might have occurred after the trauma of the Roman-Jewish War from 66 to 73 CE and the resultant destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. The historical context certainly provided a reason for an apocalyptic outlook. And all four of the canonical Gospels were written either during or in the aftermath of that traumatic historical context. If the best reconstructions of Jesus' sayings, parables, and aphorisms, however, are non-apocalyptic, then it is reasonable to conclude that Jesus himself was not apocalyptic, and that he was not trying to start an apocalyptic movement. Jesus may have begun as a follower of the apocalyptic teacher John the Baptist, but many of his sayings, especially those preserved in the Q Gospel, which we learned a few times back, lack any apocalyptic content. At a minimum, then, Jesus turned away from his apocalyptic beginnings and instead taught and advocated a divine community of compassion in the present moment, one actively created by his followers. The Mush Gospel, what is it? It is worth noting at this point that information about the conflicting material in the Gospels, and indeed throughout the New Testament, is barely known among the average believers sitting in church pews, whether conservative or liberal. For the most part, these differences are not dwelt on or even mentioned in church. I've never heard a pastor, conservative or liberal, preach on these conflicts, except Christopher. And it is a rare believer indeed that knows that there are more differences among the available New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. There are thousands of conflicts. Even those few believers that have read the Bible from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22 would not necessarily notice the conflicts. Spotting them takes a very close reading. Instead, most Christian believers encounter in church something that the New Testament scholar Bernard Brandon Scott calls the mush gospel. By this, Scott means, speaking as someone who stands in the tradition, that Christians of all stripes mush together the various stories from all the Gospels into a single story gospel that is idiosyncratic. This mush gospel is built up from Bible readings, from hearing the gospel stories read, from sermons, and from hymns. We use the mush gospel to make sense of the gospel stories when we hear them. That is the context in which we fit them. For the most part, we never understand the single gospel as a complete story with a complex plot and characters. The individuality of each gospel narrative is lost. The rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar provides one example of how the mush gospel gets displayed in popular culture. Most recently in the live television Broadway performance in April 2018, featuring John Legend as Jesus, Sarah Bareilles as Mary Magdalene, and Alice Cooper as King Herod. The following is the last stanza of the opera, which depicts Jesus' final moments on the cross, with the gospel sources of each verse noted. God, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. From Luke. Who is my mother? Where is my mother? This being an allusion to John 19:25. My God, why have you forgotten me? Mark 15:34 and Matthew 27:46. I am thirsty, oh God, I am thirsty, I am thirsty, I am thirsty. In John 19:28, he says, I am thirsty once. It is finished, also from John, and then, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, from Luke. All four Gospels get mushed into this piece of popular culture, serving to conceal the uniqueness of each Gospel's depiction. There is much more that could be said about the conflicts and contradictions within the Gospels, but these examples illustrate my point. For our next and final installment in the series, we'll explore the book Revelation, the first epistle attributed to John, and the second epistle attributed to Peter, with some final reflections on what this modern scholarship on the Bible all means for contemporary practice of progressive Christianity.
Wow. All right.
Just as we were pulling up, getting ready to come in for church, Bernie's radio station playlist cycled up Ray Stevens' Would Jesus Wear a Rolex on his Salvation show. If you've never heard it, go to YouTube and find it. It's a great song. And the context would say, the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels, no, he wouldn't wear a Rolex. Jesus of John? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, probably even. He would have been down on Rolexes and some nice cars and some fancy clothes. So, the other thing, just as an aside, as an addendum, this kind of key conflict between two scholars that that I value, Christopher values, and that both get presented their content here. Bart Ehrman and Dominic Crossan. The Jesus Seminar, in the Gospel of Jesus according to the Jesus Seminar, this passage that Veronica read is not there. And it's not there because it's quite apocalyptic. I mean, the whole thing is that Jesus describing the future Son of Man coming to judge humanity. So they conclude that if it's apocalyptic, it wasn't Jesus. So this wasn't something Jesus would have said. Bart Ehrman makes totally the opposite argument. That yes, that passage is apocalyptic. Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. He very likely said this. In the absence of more definitive, exciting archaeological finds, I don't know that this debate could ever actually be resolved. But anyway, hopefully there's some meat there to chat about for the next few minutes. I see some animated conversation. Would you come up with?
I was saying that I think it's frustrating that Christians focus on apocalyptic literature and they can be apocalyptic because specifically. It's also they get excited about climate change because they think it's a sign of the end times.
Right.
And I don't think that's biblical at all. It's really frustrating for me because that's where Christians kind of hang their hat.
Right. Christopher was sharing for those in the cyber audience that there is certain wings of American Christianity that looks at apocalyptic things like the fires in Australia as kind of good, happy signs that the world is about to end, and that's something to be excited and happy about. Certainly, in my own, field research, that's very much the view I found as the dominant view amongst my evangelicals as I visited them. The very idea that you'd ever be worried about environmental issues, climate change, is just so ridiculous to this mindset.
Well, I was just saying, what do they think Jesus is going to do when he comes back?
Depends on which one comes back.
That's what I said.
Is it the Jesus of John, or is it the Jesus of Matthew? And so.
So I was saying that, I think
Yeah.
protest with us, and
Well, I mean, just as a follow-up, which Jesus says that he's going to come back? Can you?
Well, I think all four of the Gospels, intimate, the idea. So that the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, and lo, I will be with you always until the end of the age. But it does postulate, and I think it is actually in John that, look, I go to my Father's house where I'm making many mansions. But even the story of the rich young ruler and turning away in sadness, it's kind of like, there is do this good thing now in this lifetime of selling all that you have and giving it to the poor, and you will be storing up treasure in heaven. So even, the Jesus of the Synoptics is, dangling a reward out there. So I would say, ultimately, that idea of a future reward for righteous behavior now, is present, certainly in the tradition, as depicted in all four of the Gospels. Well, I would have to go read Mark. I mean, Mark is ambiguous because all it has is an empty tomb and some scared women that run away. And so exactly what happened. Did somebody just come steal the body? I mean, Mark does not rule that out as a possibility. You can see that must have been something people, argued because, the future Gospels of Matthew and Luke both try to refute it. But anyway, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
I don't know if you all have been keeping track of current events. There are times where I wish we didn't have to. I really miss the days, just a few years ago, where we could talk about things that came up in the world. We talk about climate change a lot because that was something we needed to take more seriously. We talk about police brutality. We talk about school shootings, but it wasn't like on a weekly basis where we're constantly on red alert every morning where we're like, looking at the damage report on CNN and like, oh my God, what now? What is frustrating for me, and the conversation that I had this morning, is that the church is so focused on this supposed end of the world, which, by the way, is just, it's not even good theology. Like the coming apocalypse and stuff like that it was apocalyptic literature for that time. Like, I think Jesus even said, some of you will live to see this. The people there, obviously, the end of the world did not happen. He was speaking, I think, more, if he did actually say it, to the end of the temple, to the end of the Roman Empire. That was the essence of the apocalypse. And we're still trapped there 2,000 years later, to where we ignore things like climate change. We ignore scientists that are saying if things don't change 20 years ago, then this world is gonna end. I mean, there are some scientists that are saying that there are children that have been born right now that will die because of catastrophic effects in the earth due to the climate crisis. So this is a serious issue. And so many Christians think it's a positive thing because of really bad theology, which is why I appreciate what Bernie talks about so much, because so many people are unaware of what the Bible actually says in context. And I think, right now, as the church, we should probably put the apocalypse on the back burner and focus on the end of our nation right now. This past week was basically the end of democracy. There is now no longer due process in this country. There is now no longer a series of checks and balances in this country. And that should terrify everyone in this room, including Republicans and especially Christians. We have to start taking things that are going on in this world more seriously. But I think the problem with Americans, and especially Christians, is because of these twisted beliefs that we've garnered over the years, is we're hopelessly optimistic. We think things are just going to get better. If we have the right attitude, if we pray the right way, or if we just trust that God's going to come back on a white horse and set all things right, that things are going to work themselves out. And I gotta say, it's time to put those ridiculous, childish beliefs to bed and start listening to scientists. Please. Because as Miss Betty said, if Jesus were to hypothetically come back, and I'm not sure that that was the language Jesus was trying to present, but if Jesus did, I don't think he would be coming back to join the right wing of American Christianity and the ridiculousness. I think he would have some harsh words of criticism for how the movement has gone astray. The fact that racism is still a thing is a problem. The fact that capitalism has run rampant and is totally unbridled is a problem. The fact that climate change has not been taken seriously is a problem. The fact that sexism is at play in everything that we do, that's a problem. And I think Jesus would have a major problem in the church spearheading all of those issues throughout history. So, where we make changes, and we may not see a substantial change in this lifetime, but where we start is in the institution that sowed it in the first place. Amen? Amen. But until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wasteland and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to